Well, good morning. This is Ian R. Crane, and it's an absolutely beautiful morning here in mid-December, coming to you from the southwest of England. And it's been a very interesting weekend, and no doubt it's going to be an extremely interesting week. And the title of this morning's live stream update is, "Are you fracking serious, Greg?" And of course, this is a direct question to Greg Clark, because for so many reasons, he should now be seriously thinking about kicking Barclays Bank, trading as Third Energy's application to frack at Kirby Misperton well into touch. Certainly into the long grass, and hope that it's never found. And of course, I'm sure that the Christmas recess can't come quick enough for him, because I'm sure he's being absolutely bombarded with correspondence in so many forms from both those who desperately want Barclays Bank, trading as Third Energy, to frack at Kirby Misperton, and of course the increasing number of people who certainly do not. Well, Greg, you have so many good reasons not to sign this off. It would be remiss, in fact I would even argue that it would be malfeasance, it would be misuse of public office if you were to sign off this application at Kirby Misperton. And of course today you actually have a prima facie reason just to push all the paperwork away from you, because today, under Home Office regulations, should be the day which Third Energy is effectively dissolved. Now, I'm sure that you are going to be under enormous pressure to ignore that particular regulation. And of course, last year, Third Energy actually didn't file their accounts, I think, until either late January or maybe even early February, and they should have been dissolved back then, but they weren't. So here we go again, and you would think, knowing the scrutiny that they're under, you would think that Third Energy would do everything they possibly can, and their owners, Barclays Bank, would also be doing everything they possibly can to avoid falling into this same trap yet again. But there's a good reason. Shut them down. They are not operating viably. Okay, they have access to phenomenal debt. But the bottom line is, once again, they have demonstrated that they are not competent in terms of normal business operations. So somehow I don't think you're going to do that, but that would be the right thing to do, wouldn't it, Greg? If you are going to uphold the law that you, as a government minister, as a representative of Her Majesty's government, as Secretary of State, you should uphold the law and dissolve Third Energy forthwith. Well, if that's not enough to shut it down, then how about the fact that it's now been established that the Oil and Gas Authority, of course, of which you, Greg Clark, are the sole shareholder, so despite your efforts to put this at arm's length, you can't. It's you operating under the guise of the Oil and Gas Authority. But under freedom of information, it's been pretty well established that the Oil and Gas Authority have absolutely no knowledge whatsoever of Third Energy's third-party insurance liabilities, or indeed their cover. And it seems once again that the regulatory body, which relies upon its revenue from the industry that it's supposed to regulate, and of course two of the directors are, I'm going to say not major shareholders, but they have a shareholding interest in Shell, BP, ConocoPhillips and Phillips 66. So, no conflicts of interest there, eh? Come on, guys. Get your act cleaned up at the very least. But anyway, the Oil and Gas Authority have no knowledge, apparently, of Third Energy's insurance arrangements. Coupled with which, it's becoming increasingly evident that the emergency services are extremely uncomfortable with the fact that this pad has not been designed, or even any cognizance taken off, into account of the emergency evacuation process. And as I pointed out on episode 114 of Fracking Nightmare, Third Energy have effectively created a prison by putting the containers and then the scaffolding and the screening around almost 3 sides of the site. But 3 sides of the site is also surrounded by fencing, and there's only one emergency pedestrian exit at the back, which goes over the berm at the rear, which goes through a gate onto the public footpath at the rear of the pad. There's another pedestrian exit off of the lower pad, KMA. Other than that, the only exit is the track down alongside KMA and down the farm track. So if there is any kind of emergency whatsoever, the emergency services have no possible way of getting their vehicles onto that site. So the only thing that they can do is let it burn. And Greg, this has been pointed out to you now on so many occasions by so many people that once again, it would be remiss of you to even consider signing this off. In fact, the whole thing should be disbanded, and basically if Barclays Bank, trading as Third Energy, want to frack that pad, they should go completely back to the drawing board and seek planning permission from North Yorkshire County Council to extend the pad and effectively make it fit for use. By which time, of course, hopefully we've got this whole industry shut down in the UK. Well, meanwhile, we'll see how things unfold, of course, during the week. But there are some interesting articles now starting to appear in the media. And it seems that I and some journalists at The Independent are tapping into the same rich vein of inspiration, if you like. Because a little under 2 weeks ago, in my morning live stream update, I discussed the issue of fracking and stillbirths and low birth weights. And I focused particularly on the research that had come out of Vernal in Utah, where the midwives, some 7 years ago now, had started to realize that, you know, despite having never or barely ever had a stillbirth, they were increasing, you know, beyond a rate that could be considered normal. And the only thing that had changed was the unconventional hydrocarbons industry had rolled into town. Well, then the Independent ran an article, and have it here. This is just 4 days ago now, and the article was titled "Baby's Health Suffers from Being Born Near Fracking Sites, Finds Major Study." So, you know, at least now we have some elements within the mainstream media actually starting to take the lead and do their own research and print these disturbing articles. And I have to say that the Independent and The Guardian have been doing this actually now over the course of the last 3 or 4 years, but have yet to really gain sufficient traction for it to be picked up on a broader basis. Well, 2 days after doing that particular live stream, my live stream update on the Friday week ago was on the waste issue and the fact that in the US, with their 1 million plus fracked wells, they have run into massive problems with the disposal of the frack waste. Starting with the evaporation ponds, which are fortunately illegal in Europe, but the evaporation ponds weren't cutting it, they weren't getting rid of the waste quick enough. So then they started the process of re-injection, which has effectively created massive seismic trauma throughout the US, but particularly in Oklahoma, where some 10,000 wells were used for the re-injection of frack waste. And over the last 7 years, it's turned Oklahoma into the fracking waste capital, and therefore the seismic capital of the US. Despite Oklahoma having very, very stable geology prior to about 2010, this phenomenal volume of frack waste has destabilized the geology, and now Oklahoma is the earthquake capital of the US, taken over from California. Well, just I believe this morning, I believe it may be in this morning's Independent, because this article was released on the Independent website yesterday afternoon. But the headline of the article is "Fracking in Britain could be limited by lack of specialist waste facilities." Now, this is directly related to the research that's been conducted at Edinburgh University, looking at the issue of waste and waste disposal from the unconventional gas industry. Now, at the moment, the only issue has been the Priest Hall waste, and of course that was not disposed of correctly. United Utilities were trying to deal with it. It was beyond their capability, and they ended up dumping something like 2 million gallons of fluids into the Manchester Ship Canal without any third-party oversight. And the waste issue is an issue that is being dodged by everybody. So Third Energy, initially, of course, just like Quadrilla, said, well, don't worry about it, because we're going to reuse the waste, we're going to process it on site and then reuse it in subsequent frack jobs. Well, the reality is, first of all, there's no room on that frack pad for any processing facility. And secondly, that technology doesn't exist, because, as we said many times, they have to use fresh water. So where does it go? Well, that's a good question. At the moment, Brand Sands, just outside Redcar, which is a treatment facility run by Northumbria Water. And then there's Nostrop on the outskirts of Leeds. That's pretty much all we have. But even these companies, and of course the spokesman for the waste industry is Lee Petts of Remsol, who just trots out the palliatives and says, oh yeah, of course we can handle it. But they've not yet had the opportunity to try to deal with the phenomenal levels of contamination, and particularly the radioactive elements of that waste. So this research, this report from Edinburgh says, basically, where's it going to go? Because in the US, they haven't got any processes for dealing with the waste. It's either evaporation pits, re-injection, or dumping into the Gulf of Mexico. And we now know that in 2014 alone, some 74 billion gallons of frack waste was dumped unceremoniously into the Gulf of Mexico. And the reality is that that method of disposal of the frack waste continues in the US to this day. And I'm told that Donald Trump has signed off on another 75+ billion gallons being dumped into the Gulf of Mexico. So the Gulf of Mexico is fast becoming one of the most toxic seas in the world. And you know, the sad thing is that the Gulf of Mexico, of course, feeds the Gulf Stream. So eventually this toxicity will make its way into the Atlantic, across the Atlantic, and across up towards Northern Europe. Now that might take a while, but you know, the effects of that are going to be felt at some point in the future. But of course, they're not being felt right now, so that's okay. Politicians can completely ignore that potential risk, and meanwhile claim that, no, don't worry about the waste because we'll have it sorted. Well, that's what we've been hearing now for like 5 years, and you haven't got it sorted. You don't know where it's going, and the risk is that basically you're going to end up with a situation just like in the US, where the only option you got is to dump it at sea. And who are you going to get to do that? Well, INEOS, because they've already said that that's what they'd really like to do. And no doubt they can sort of create another hole in a pipeline somewhere and just feed it into the sea somewhat surreptitiously. Well, you know, the reality is that the anti-fracking community is having a very significant effect in this country. And you know, the fact that all that kit has been sitting on the site at Kirby Misperton for all but 6 weeks now, I think speaks absolute volumes. And you know, the pressure is certainly going to be sustained. Well, yesterday we got the absolute confirmation that we are having an effect, because David Rose was trotted out. Now, David Rose and Ben Webster are the journalists that are trotted out by the establishment whenever they need a hit piece, particularly on individuals or groups that are starting to become a bit of an irritant to the establishment. And so yesterday, on pages 32 and 33 of the Mail on Sunday, was a David Rose investigation. There we go. The criminals, crackpots and extremists who have poisoned the anti-fracking camp protests. Well, apart from the fact that it's full of lies and slander, and that no doubt David Rose and the Mail on Sunday will be hearing from the individuals that have been particularly slandered. But the only thing he could come up with about me was a mention. He said, Ian Crane is a conspiracy theorist who hosts weekly internet TV shows in which he proclaims terrorist outrages such as 9/11 and recent attacks in London were the work of the British and American governments. Your point being, David? Well, as I always say, do your own research. Make no more comment than that. Do your own research. Obviously, David Rose once again demonstrates that you know, his research is somewhat myopic and pretty much based on cut and paste. So anyway, we'll see how that unfolds. But The Guardian, I have to say, ran a much better article on Saturday, looking at people who have become activists on different aspects of society, but for the first time in their lives. And the article actually featured Eddie Thornton, who of course is not only a resident of Rydale in North Yorkshire, but he's also been resident on the Kirby Misperton protection camp pretty much since we took the field on December the 20th last year. So isn't it ironic that you know, the anniversary of taking the field at Kirby Misperton is also the 6 weeks on which that Third Energy will have had their kit on site standing dormant, costing somebody in excess of £100,000 a day in rental, plus of course whatever costs they have associated with keeping the frack crew on hand, ready to come and press the buttons at the moment's notice. So that was a great article, and well acknowledging Eddie's contribution to the anti-fracking campaign. And Eddie, like many other people, you know, myself included, are actually on the, shall I say, on the activist network for the first time in our lives. And you know, this is really symptomatic of the speed with which the British government has completely lost touch with the population in this country, and is simply pushing through a corporatist agenda that doesn't have the best interests of you or me at heart. It only has the interests of the corporations. So we've got an interesting week coming up. It's the final week before Christmas. Obviously Parliament goes into recess later this week. Doubt very much that anyone's really going to be too motivated to be looking at anything too serious. It's time for things to become a little bit more light-hearted. No, not too light-hearted, because you know, I have to make the observation that you know, I made the observation yesterday on my Twitter account that David Rose could have written a much more salacious article if he actually bothered to do any research into the criminal backgrounds of the 650 or so people whose workplace is Westminster. And that's just in Parliament itself. And if you actually look at what's occurring on the periphery amongst their research community, it's not a pretty picture. So I would suggest that in the scheme of things, considering the number of people who are part of the anti-fracking community, it's a very, very broad community covering all parts of society, all philosophical, religious beliefs, then I think the likelihood is that you know, we actually have a pretty good track record. And you know, if we've got a few people that've got a bit of history, well, that's, you know, so be it, as it were. Anyway, that's it from me today. So please do your own research. Please read this article in the Independent today. If you don't want to buy the Independent, then please look at it online, because it's a very, very important feature. Fracking in Britain could be limited by the lack of specialist waste facilities. This is an absolutely crucial element which the government and the industry have completely ignored for the past 5 years. So what makes you think that they're going to find the solution in the next 5 minutes? Thanks again for joining me this morning, and I'll catch you tomorrow morning at 8:30.